Samuel Mackenzie had always been a big man. At 52, he still stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer. The local folks called him Bear, and the name fit perfectly. His thick brown beard was now streaked with gray, and his hands were rough from years of cutting trees and living alone in the mountains of Montana. Bear had been living by himself for almost 8 years now. His small wooden cabin sat on the edge of a cliff, surrounded by tall pine trees that seemed to touch the sky. He had built the place with his own hands after leaving his job at the lumber mill. City life had never suited him. Too many people, too much noise, too many rules. Up here in the mountains, he could live the way he wanted. Winter had always been hard in these parts, but this year was different. The snow started falling in October and never seemed to stop. By November, it was already 3 feet deep around his cabin. The temperature dropped so low that even Bear, who was used to the cold, had to wear 2 coats just to go outside. Then came the accident that changed everything. Bear had been cutting firewood near a steep slope when his foot slipped on a patch of ice hidden under the snow. He tumbled down the hill, his left leg getting caught between 2 large rocks. The crack of his bone breaking echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. For 2 hours he lay there in the snow, unable to move. The pain was so bad that he almost passed out several times. Finally, using a thick branch as a crutch, he managed to drag himself back to his cabin, but he knew right away that this was serious. His leg was bent at a strange angle, and every step sent lightning bolts of pain through his whole body. Bear had always been proud of taking care of himself. He had never asked anyone for help, and he wasn't about to start now. Using some old boards and rope, he made a rough cast for his leg. It wasn't pretty, but it would have to do. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away in town, and the roads were already blocked with snow. As the weeks passed, Bear realized he was in real trouble. With his broken leg, he couldn't chop enough firewood to keep his cabin warm. He couldn't hunt for food or even walk far enough to check his rabbit traps. His stored food was running low, and he was burning through his wood supply much faster than usual. The cold was getting worse every day. Some mornings he would wake up to find ice on the inside of his windows. His breath came out in white clouds even inside the cabin. The pain in his leg made it hard to sleep, and he was getting weaker from not eating enough. Bear started to wonder if this was how it would end for him. Alone in the mountains, just like he had always wanted, but dying of cold and hunger wasn't exactly the peaceful end he had imagined. That's when he started noticing the gifts. It began with a bundle of firewood that appeared near his cabin one morning. Bear limped outside, confused. The wood was neatly stacked and tied with rope. It was good dry wood that would burn hot and long. He looked around, but there were no footprints in the snow, no sign of who had left it. A few days later, he found a cloth bag hanging on his door handle. Inside were jars of canned vegetables, dried meat, and even some homemade cookies. The food was still warm, which meant whoever had brought it lived close by. More gifts kept coming. Warm blankets appeared on his porch. A pair of thick wool socks was left by his door. Someone even left a bottle of medicine that helped with the pain in his leg. Bear was grateful, but he was also confused and a little embarrassed. He had spent years avoiding people, wanting to be left alone. Now someone was taking care of him like he was a helpless child. He tried staying awake at night to catch whoever was helping him, but he never saw anyone. The gifts just appeared like magic, always when he wasn't looking. One snowy evening in January, Bear was sitting by his fire, feeling sorry for himself. His leg was healing slowly, but he was still weak and couldn't do much. He was down to his last few pieces of firewood when he heard a strange sound outside. It was voices. Women's voices talking quietly in the snow. Bear grabbed his rifle and limped to the window. Through the falling snow, he could see 3 figures near his woodpile. They were women, all wearing thick coats and moving carefully through the deep snow. One of them was stacking more firewood near his cabin. Another was hanging a bag of supplies on his door. The third woman was standing watch, looking around to make sure no one saw them. Bear recognized them right away. They were the Williamson sisters, Martha, Ruth, and Grace. They lived in a small house about 5 miles down the mountain. He had seen them in town a few times over the years, but he had never talked to them. The 3 sisters were not popular in the local community. People whispered about them behind their backs. They called them strange and unfriendly. The sisters kept to themselves, just like Bear did. But unlike him, They seemed to care about helping others. Bear watched as the women finished their work and disappeared back into the snowy forest. He felt a warm feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. These 3 women who barely knew him had been keeping him alive all winter long. Martha was the oldest at 67. She had been married to a farmer who died in a tractor accident 5 years ago. Ruth was 64 and had lost her husband to a heart attack. Grace, the youngest at 61, had been a widow the longest. Her husband had died in the war almost 20 years ago. All 3 women were what people called heavy-set. They were big, strong women who weren't afraid of hard work. But the folks in town often made cruel jokes about their appearance. They called them names behind their backs and treated them like they were invisible. The sisters lived together in their small house, sharing expenses and keeping each other company. They had their own vegetable garden, some chickens, and a few goats. They made their own clothes, canned their own food, and rarely asked anyone for help. Bear had heard the gossip about them in town, but he had never paid much attention. Now he realized that while everyone else was talking about how strange the sisters were, they were the only ones with enough kindness to help a stranger in need. As February arrived, the gifts kept coming. The sisters brought him fresh bread, warm soup, and even some of their homemade medicine for his leg. They never asked for anything in return, and they never tried to talk to him or come inside his cabin. Bear's leg was getting better, but he was still too weak to take care of himself properly. The sisters seemed to understand this. They brought him exactly what he needed, when he needed it. One night, during a particularly bad snowstorm, Bear heard someone on his porch again. When he looked outside the next morning, he found a pile of coal for his stove and a note written in careful handwriting. "Hope you are feeling better. The worst of winter will be over soon. Stay strong." It wasn't signed, but Bear knew it was from the sisters. By March, Bear was finally able to walk without too much pain. His leg was still stiff, but he could get around his cabin and even venture outside for short periods. The first thing he did was walk to where the sisters had been leaving the firewood. There, carved into a tree, he found a simple message. "For our neighbor Bear, with friendship." Bear stood there in the melting snow, reading those words over and over. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to have someone care about him. These 3 women had saved his life, and they had done it without expecting anything in return. He made a decision right then and there. Somehow, some way, he was going to find a way to pay them back for their kindness. Bear didn't know it yet, but he would soon get his chance. The winter that had almost killed him was finally coming to an end. But Bear's story with the Williamson sisters was just beginning. Spring came slowly to the Montana mountains that year. By April, the snow had melted enough for Bear to walk the 5 miles down to the sisters' house. His leg was still tender, but he was determined to thank them properly for saving his life. Bear had never been good with words, especially when it came to feelings. But he knew he had to try. He practiced what he would say during the long walk down the mountain path. "Thank you for the food. I appreciate your kindness. You saved my life." Nothing sounded right. When he finally reached their small wooden house, Bear was surprised by what he saw. The place looked run down. The roof had several missing shingles, and the front porch was sagging on one side. The paint was peeling off the walls, and the fence around their garden was falling apart. Bear knocked on the door, his heart beating fast. He heard footsteps inside, then whispered voices. Finally, the door opened a crack, and Grace peeked out. Her eyes went wide when she saw him. "Oh my," she said, opening the door wider. "It's Bear Mackenzie from up the mountain." Martha and Ruth appeared behind their younger sister. All 3 women looked nervous, like they had been caught doing something wrong. "I wanted to thank you," Bear said, his voice rougher than usual. "For the firewood and food. You saved my life this winter." The sisters looked at each other, and Martha stepped forward. She was the tallest of the 3, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "We don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her face was turning red. "Please," Bear said. "I saw you that night in January. I know it was you 3 who helped me." Ruth, who was shorter and rounder than her sisters, started crying quietly. "We just couldn't let you starve up there," she said. It wouldn't have been right. Grace, the smallest but fiercest of the 3, wiped her sister's tears. "We didn't want any thanks. We just did what anyone should do for a neighbor." Bear stood there awkwardly, not sure what to say next. He had brought them a carved wooden box as a gift, but it seemed too small compared to what they had done for him. "Would you like some coffee?" Martha asked. "It's not much, but it's hot." Bear nodded and followed them inside. The house was small but clean. The furniture was old and worn, but everything was neat and tidy. The walls were covered with photographs of their late husbands and family members. As they sat around the kitchen table, drinking weak coffee from chipped cups, Bear learned more about the sisters' situation. Things were not going well for them. Grace explained that their husbands had left them some money when they died, but it wasn't much. They had been living off their small pensions and the money they made selling vegetables and eggs in town. "But people don't buy much from us anymore," Ruth said sadly. "They say we're too strange, too different." Bear had heard the talk in town. People made fun of the sisters because they were overweight and didn't dress like other women their age. They wore men's work clothes and boots instead of dresses and nice shoes. They spoke their minds instead of staying quiet like women were supposed to. "The truth is," Martha said, lowering her voice, "we're in trouble. Real trouble." She got up and pulled a letter from a drawer. The official-looking document had big red letters stamped across the top. "Final notice. The county says we owe back taxes," Martha explained. "Our husbands handled all the money matters when they were alive. We didn't know about some of the debts they left behind." Bear read the letter carefully. The sisters owed over $8,000 in back taxes and fees. It was money they didn't have. "If we can't pay by the end of this month, they're going to take our house and land," Grace said, her voice shaking. "They're going to auction it off to whoever has the money to buy it." Bear felt anger rising in his chest. These good women who had spent their own money to keep him alive all winter were about to lose their home. "It wasn't fair. What will you do?" he asked. "We don't know," Ruth said, wiping her eyes. "We have a little money saved, but not nearly enough. We've asked everyone we know for help, but—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Bear understood. The sisters didn't have many friends in town. People saw them as odd and unfriendly. No one was going to help three fat old widows who didn't fit in. "We've talked about splitting up," Martha said. "Maybe each of us could find a room to rent somewhere, or maybe one of our distant relatives would take us in." Bear could see how much this idea hurt them. The three sisters had been through everything together. They had buried their husbands, survived hard times, and taken care of each other. Now they might have to spend their final years apart, alone and depending on the charity of others. "There's something else," Grace said quietly. "We spent some of our savings helping you this winter. The food, the medicine, the coal, it all cost money we really couldn't afford to spend." Bear felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. These women had given up their own security to keep him alive. They had literally taken food from their own table to feed him. "Why?" he asked. "Why would you do that when you were already in trouble?" Martha smiled sadly. "Because that's what neighbors do. That's what decent people do. We couldn't let you die up there alone, even if it meant we might lose our home." Bear sat in silence for a long moment, looking at these three remarkable women. The people in town called them strange and unwanted, but they had more courage and kindness than anyone he had ever met. "When is the auction?" he asked. 2 weeks from today," Grace said. "April 28th. They're going to sell our land to whoever bids the most money." Bear stood up, his mind already working. "I need to go to town. I need to talk to some people at the bank." The sisters looked confused. "Bear, you don't have to worry about this," Martha said. "It's our problem." "No," Bear said firmly. "You made it my problem when you saved my life. I'm not going to let you lose your home because you were kind to a stranger." As Bear walked back up the mountain that evening, his leg aching with every step, he thought about what he could do. He had some money saved from his years working at the lumber mill. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. The next morning, Bear did something he hadn't done in over 2 years. He shaved his beard, put on his cleanest clothes, and started the long journey to town. He had 40 miles to cover, and his truck had been sitting under a tarp all winter. It took him 3 hours to get the old vehicle started, but finally, the engine coughed to life. As Bear drove down the winding mountain road, he passed the sisters' house. He could see them working in their garden, trying to make the best of their situation. They waved when they saw his truck, but they had no idea what he was planning to do. Bear had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten how to be part of a community. But the Williamson sisters had reminded him that sometimes people need each other. Sometimes the right thing to do is help, even when it's hard. He was going to find a way to save their home or die trying. These 3 women had given him back his life. Now it was time for him to return the favor. Bear's old pickup truck rattled and wheezed as it made its way down the mountain road toward town. He hadn't driven in over 2 years, and being around this many people again felt strange and uncomfortable. His hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he passed houses, then businesses, then finally reached the main street of Cedar Falls. The town looked smaller than he remembered. There were only about 3,000 people living here, but after years of seeing nothing but trees and mountains, it felt like a big city to Bear. People walked along the sidewalks, talking and laughing. Cars drove by with music playing. Children rode their bicycles and called out to their friends. Bear parked his truck outside the First National Bank and sat there for a few minutes, gathering his courage. He caught sight of himself in the rearview mirror and almost didn't recognize the man looking back at him. Even with a fresh shave and clean clothes, he looked wild and rough. His hair was too long. His skin was weathered from years of mountain sun and wind, and his eyes held the distant look of someone who had spent too much time alone. When Bear walked into the bank, conversations stopped. People turned to stare at the big mountain man who had suddenly appeared among them. A few people recognized him and whispered to their friends, "That's Bear McKenzie. He used to work at the lumber mill. Lives up on the mountain now like some kind of hermit." Bear ignored the stares and walked up to the front desk. A young woman with perfectly styled hair and a bright smile looked up at him nervously. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a little higher than normal. "I need to talk to someone about the Williamson property," Bear said. "The house and land that's going up for auction." The woman's smile faded. Let me get Mr. Peterson for you. He's handling that case." A few minutes later, a short, balding man in an expensive suit came out to meet Bear. Harold Peterson was the bank's loan officer, and he had the look of someone who enjoyed having power over other people. "Mr. McKenzie, isn't it?" Peterson said, not offering to shake hands. "I remember you from the old days at the mill." "What can I do for you?" "I want to know about the Williamson sisters' debt," Bear said. "How much they owe, what the payment terms are." Peterson looked surprised. "That's confidential information. Are you a family member?" "No," Bear said. "But I'm interested in helping them." Peterson laughed, a sound that wasn't friendly at all. "Helping them? Those 3 old women have been nothing but trouble for this community. They're strange, unfriendly, and they don't pay their bills on time. Honestly, it'll be better for everyone when someone else owns that property." Bear felt his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. "How much do they owe?" "I'm not supposed to discuss specific amounts," Peterson said. "But since it's going to be public information at the auction anyway, I can tell you it's over $8,000. Plus fees and interest, we're looking at probably $10,000 total." Bear nodded. That was more than he had hoped, but not impossible. What if someone wanted to pay off their debt? Would that stop the auction? Peterson studied Bear carefully. "You're serious about this, aren't you? Do you have that kind of money?" "Maybe," Bear said. "What would it take to save their house?" "Well," Peterson said, seeming to enjoy Bear's discomfort, "even if someone paid off the back taxes, there are other problems. The sisters have been late on their regular payments for months. The bank would need some kind of guarantee that future payments would be made on time." Bear realized this was going to be more complicated than just paying off a debt. The banker was making it clear that he didn't want to help the sisters, even if someone offered to pay what they owed. "What about the auction?" Bear asked. "How does that work?" "Public auction next Thursday at 10 in the morning, Peterson said. "Right there on the courthouse steps. Highest bidder wins the property. We expect it to sell for at least $15,000, maybe more. It's a nice piece of land." Bear left the bank feeling frustrated and angry. It was clear that Peterson and probably others in town wanted the sisters gone. They saw the auction as a chance to get rid of 3 women they considered undesirable. Bear's next stop was the courthouse, where he learned more about the legal side of the situation. The clerk, an older woman who remembered him from his mill days, was more helpful than the banker had been. "It's a shame about those sisters," she said quietly. "They're good women, just different. But once the auction notice is published, there's no stopping it unless the debt is paid in full plus penalties." Bear spent the rest of the day walking around town, thinking and planning. He stopped at the general store to buy some supplies and overheard people talking about the upcoming auction. "I heard Jake Morrison is interested in that land," one man said. He wants to turn it into a hunting lodge for rich folks from the city. Good, said another. Those weird sisters have been an embarrassment to this town for too long. Maybe normal people will buy the place. Bear wanted to tell these people exactly what he thought of their opinions, but he kept quiet. Getting into a fight wouldn't help the sisters. That evening, Bear drove back up to his cabin and spent hours going through his finances. He had been saving money for years, living simply and spending very little. Most of his savings were hidden in a metal box buried under his cabin floor. He didn't trust banks much. By candlelight, Bear counted his money carefully. He had almost $12,000 saved up. It was every penny he had in the world, money he had planned to use for emergencies or maybe to fix up his cabin someday. It would be enough to pay off the sisters' debt, but just barely. And if he spent it all, he would have nothing left for himself. If something happened to him, another accident, a serious illness, he would be in the same situation the sisters were in now. Bear sat by his fire that night, staring into the flames and thinking hard. He could save the sisters' home, but it would mean risking his own future security. If he helped them and something went wrong, he might end up homeless and penniless himself. But then he remembered that cold January night when the sisters had left firewood and food for him. They had spent their own money to keep him alive. Even though they were already in financial trouble, they had risked their own security to help a stranger. How could he do any less for them? The next morning, Bear made his decision. He dug up his money box and loaded all his cash into a canvas bag. Then he drove back to town, determined to find a way to help the sisters keep their home. But when he got to the bank, he discovered that Peterson had been expecting him. "I thought you might be back," the banker said with a smug smile. "I've been asking around about you, Mackenzie. You live alone up on that mountain, don't you? No job, no regular income. How exactly do you plan to guarantee the sisters' future payments?" Bear realized he had walked into a trap. Even if he paid off the current debt, Peterson could find other reasons to force the sisters off their land later. "You don't want to help them," Bear said. "You want them gone?" Peterson shrugged. "I want what's best for this community. Those women don't fit in here. They never have." Bear left the bank feeling defeated. Peterson had made it clear that even paying off the debt wouldn't be enough. The banker would find other ways to force the sisters out. That night, Bear sat in his cabin trying to think of another plan. The auction was in just a few days and he was running out of options. Then it hit him. If he couldn't stop the auction, maybe he could win it. Bear had never been to a public auction before, but he understood the basic idea. People bid against each other, and whoever offered the most money got the property. If he could outbid everyone else, he could buy the sisters' land himself and then let them stay. It was a risky plan. He would have to bid against other people who might have more money than he did. And even if he won, owning the property would make him responsible for all the costs and taxes that had gotten the sisters into trouble in the first place, but it was the only chance he could think of to save their home. Bear spent the next 3 days preparing for the auction. He went back to town and learned everything he could about how the bidding process worked. He found out who else might be interested in buying the property, and he practiced staying calm under pressure, because he knew the auction would be nerve-wracking. Most importantly, he kept his plan secret. He didn't want the sisters to know what he was planning in case it didn't work. Better to let them think he had given up than to give them false hope. The night before the auction, Bear hardly slept. He kept thinking about everything that could go wrong. What if someone bid more money than he had? What if there were legal problems he didn't know about? What if his plan backfired and made things worse for the sisters? But every time he started to doubt himself, Bear remembered the sisters' kindness during that terrible winter. They had saved his life without asking for anything in return. Now it was his turn to save them. Tomorrow everyone in town would learn what the strange mountain man was really made of. Thursday morning came with gray skies and a cool wind that made everyone pull their coats tighter. By 9:30, a crowd had gathered on the courthouse steps in Cedar Falls. Word had spread quickly about the auction, and it seemed like half the town had come to watch. Bear arrived early and parked his truck across the street. He sat behind the wheel for several minutes, watching people arrive and gathering his courage. In his jacket pocket was an envelope containing every dollar he owned in the world, $12,347 in cash. The courthouse steps were buzzing with conversation. Bear recognized most of the faces in the crowd. There was Jake Morrison, a local businessman who owned several properties around town. Morrison was talking loudly to anyone who would listen about his plans to turn the sisters' land into a hunting lodge. "That property is perfect for what I have in mind," Morrison was saying. "Close enough to town for supplies, but far enough out to feel wild. Rich folks from the city will pay good money to hunt in country like that." Near Morrison stood a group of local farmers, including Tom Bradley and his grown sons. They were interested in the sisters' land for different reasons. They wanted to expand their own holdings and maybe raise cattle on the mountain pasture. Bear also noticed several people who had just come to watch the show. Mrs. Henderson from the general store was there, along with her gossip circle. They whispered among themselves, pointing at different people in the crowd and speculating about who might win the bidding. At exactly 10 o'clock, the courthouse doors opened and the county auctioneer came out. He was a tall, thin man named Robert Clay, who had been conducting auctions in the area for over 20 years. Behind him came several bank officials, including Harold Peterson, who looked very pleased with himself. But the people Bear was most concerned about were standing off to one side, away from the main crowd. Martha, Ruth, and Grace Williamson had come to watch their home being sold to strangers. All three sisters were dressed in their best clothes, simple dark dresses and worn but polished shoes. They stood close together, holding hands, and Bear could see that Ruth was crying quietly. The sight of the sisters' pain made Bear's decision feel even more important. These women had spent their whole lives in that house. They had buried their husbands from that front porch, raised gardens in that soil, and created memories in every room. Now they were watching it all slip away. Auctioneer Clay called for attention and began reading the legal description of the property. 43 acres of mountain land, including a 2-bedroom house, barn, and outbuildings. Property is being sold to satisfy tax debts and liens totaling $9,812. He looked around the crowd with practiced eyes. "Bidding will start at $10,000. Do I hear 10,000? Jake Morrison immediately raised his hand. "10,000, he called out in a confident voice. "I have 10,000, Clay announced. "Do I hear 11? Tom Bradley nodded. 11,000. 11,000 from Mr. Bradley. Do I hear 12? Morrison countered quickly. 12,000. Bear watched the bidding go back and forth between Morrison and Bradley. The price kept climbing. 13,000, 14,000, 15,000. Each time the number went higher, Bear could see the sisters' faces growing more hopeless. They knew that even if the auction ended, they would never be able to afford to buy their own home back. Other people in the crowd were getting excited. This was better entertainment than they had expected. Some were even making bets on who would win. 16,000, Morrison called out, sounding a little less confident than before. Bradley hesitated. 16,000 was a lot of money for 43 acres, even with a house included. After a long pause, he shook his head. "Too rich for my blood," he said. Auctioneer Clay looked around the crowd. "I have 16,000 from Mr. Morrison. Do I hear 17?
Anyone? 17,000?
The crowd was quiet. $16,000 was more than most people in Cedar Falls made in 2 years. It looked like Morrison was going to win the property. "Going once at 16,000, Clay announced. Bear's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. This was his moment. If he was going to act, it had to be now. "Going twice at 16,000, Clay continued. Bear stood up from where he had been leaning against his truck. He raised his hand high in the air. "Wait," he called out in a voice that carried across the courthouse square. 17,000. The crowd turned to look at him, and a buzz of surprised conversation rippled through the group. Many people hadn't even noticed the mountain man standing apart from everyone else. Morrison spun around to see who was bidding against him. When he saw Bear, his face twisted with anger and disbelief. 17,000 from the gentleman by the truck, Clay announced. "Do I hear 18? Morrison hesitated. He had been planning to buy the property for around $12,000 or $13,000. At 17,000, his profit margin was getting very thin. 18,000, Morrison said finally, but his voice was no longer confident. Bear didn't hesitate. 19,000. Now the crowd was really buzzing. People were whispering to each other, trying to figure out where a mountain hermit had gotten that kind of money. Morrison looked pale. 19,000 was more than he could afford to pay and still make a profit on his hunting lodge idea. "Do I hear 20,000? Clay asked, looking at Morrison. Morrison shook his head slowly. No, I'm out. Clay looked around the crowd one more time. I have $19,000. Do I hear 20? Anyone at 20,000? The silence stretched on for what felt like forever to Bear. His hands were shaking, and sweat was running down his back despite the cool morning air. Going once at 19,000, Clay announced. Bear glanced over at the sisters. All three women were staring at him with expressions of shock and confusion. They had no idea what he was doing or why. Going twice at 19,000. In the back of his mind, Bear was doing quick math. $19,000 was more than he had in cash. But if he won the auction, he could probably get a loan for the difference. The important thing was to make sure no one else got the property. Sold, Clay announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to the gentleman by the truck for $19,000. The crowd erupted in surprised chatter. People were talking excitedly about the unexpected turn of events. Some were asking each other who Bear was and where he had gotten so much money. But the loudest voice belonged to Jake Morrison, who was red-faced and angry. "This is ridiculous," Morrison shouted. "That man lives like a wild animal up on the mountain. He probably doesn't even have $19,000. Bear walked slowly through the crowd toward the courthouse steps. People moved aside to let him pass, staring at him like he was some kind of strange creature. Harold Peterson stepped forward with a smug smile. "Mr. Mackenzie, I hope you understand that payment is due immediately. Cash or certified funds only." "I understand," Bear said quietly. Peterson's smile got wider. "And you have $19,000 in cash with you?" Bear reached into his jacket and pulled out his envelope. "I have $12,347 in cash," he said. "I'll need to arrange financing for the rest." Peterson laughed out loud. "I'm afraid that won't work, Mr. Mackenzie. If you can't pay the full amount right now, the property goes to the second highest bidder." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Morrison was grinning now, thinking he would get the property after all. But then a voice spoke up from the edge of the crowd. "Wait, I'd like to know something." Everyone turned to see Martha Williamson stepping forward. The oldest sister's face was pale, but her voice was steady and strong. "Mr. Mackenzie," she said, "why are you doing this? Why are you trying to buy our home?" Bear looked at the three sisters, then at the crowd of people surrounding them. He realized that everyone was waiting for his answer. This was his chance to tell the whole town what kind of women the Williamson sisters really were. "Because," Bear said, his voice carrying across the silent courthouse square, "without them, I'd already be dead." The crowd was completely quiet now. Even the wind seemed to have stopped blowing. Bear continued, his words coming from deep in his heart. "This winter, when I broke my leg and couldn't take care of myself, these three ladies kept me alive. They brought me food when they barely had enough for themselves. They brought me firewood when I couldn't cut my own. They brought me medicine and blankets and everything I needed to survive." He pointed at the sisters, his voice getting stronger. "You people call them strange. You call them unfriendly. You make jokes about how they look and how they dress. But when a man was dying alone on the mountain, they were the only ones who cared enough to help." Bear pulled out his envelope of money and held it up for everyone to see. "This is every dollar I have in the world. And I'm spending it to buy their house because they spent their money to save my life. They gave up their own security to help a stranger, and now I'm doing the same for them." The crowd was still silent, but Bear could see that his words were having an effect. Some people looked ashamed. Others seemed surprised to learn about the sisters' kindness. "These women are better neighbors and better people than most of you will ever be," Bear continued. The day after the auction, Bear drove his old pickup truck down to the sisters' house with a simple proposal. He found Martha, Ruth, and Grace sitting on their front porch, still trying to understand what had happened the day before. "I've been thinking," Bear said, settling his large frame into a rickety porch chair that creaked under his weight. "I now own this house and land, but I don't know the first thing about taking care of a property this size." The sisters looked at each other uncertainly. They still couldn't quite believe that their home had been saved. "What I'm thinking is this," Bear continued. "You three know this place better than anyone. You know how to fix what's broken, when to plant the garden, how to keep everything running. I need that knowledge." Martha, always the spokesperson for her sisters, leaned forward. "What are you saying, Bear?" "I'm saying I'd like to hire you as my property managers," Bear said. You keep living here, take care of the house and land like you always have, and I'll pay you a salary for your work. That way you can stay in your home and I can learn how to be a proper landowner." It was a simple arrangement, but it solved everyone's problems. The sisters could stay in the house they loved. Bear would have help managing his new property, and everyone would have a steady income. But what started as a business arrangement quickly became something much more meaningful. Within a few weeks, Bear found himself spending more and more time at the sisters' house. At first, he told himself it was just to learn about property management. Martha taught him about the vegetable garden and which crops grew best in the mountain soil. Ruth showed him how to care for the chickens and goats. Grace, who was the handiest of the three, taught him basic carpentry and how to fix the things that were always breaking around an old house. But the truth was, Bear was lonely. After 8 years of living by himself on the mountain, he had forgotten what it was like to have people to talk to at the end of the day. The sisters welcomed him into their daily routines, and slowly, he began to feel like part of a family again. The sisters were lonely too, though they would never have admitted it. They had been living together for years, but they had few friends in town and rarely had visitors. Having Bear around gave them someone new to cook for, someone to share their stories with, and someone who appreciated their company. As spring turned into summer, the arrangement deepened into something that surprised all of them. Bear started staying for dinner most evenings, then helping with the evening chores. When his old cabin felt too quiet and empty, he began spending nights in the sisters' guest room. The people of Cedar Falls watched this unusual household with curiosity, and gradually with respect. Word had spread quickly about Bear's dramatic speech at the auction and the sisters' secret acts of kindness. The story grew with each telling, and soon the 3 women who had once been considered outcasts were being praised as local heroes. Dr. Hayes stopped by regularly to check on everyone's health and became a good friend to the family. Frank Miller brought fresh vegetables from his farm and stayed to chat about crops and weather. Even some of the people who had previously avoided the sisters began to treat them with courtesy and respect. But the real changes were happening inside the little house on the mountain. Bear discovered that the sisters were much more interesting and capable than anyone in town had ever realized. Martha had once been a school teacher and could discuss books and history for hours. Ruth was an amazing cook who could make delicious meals from the simplest ingredients. Grace had a sharp sense of humor and could fix almost anything that broke. The sisters, meanwhile, saw sides of Bear that his reputation as a mountain hermit had hidden. He was gentle with the animals, patient with repairs that didn't go right the first time, and surprisingly good at helping solve problems around the house. He also had a deep knowledge of the mountains and wildlife that came from years of living alone in the wilderness. By the end of summer, they had settled into comfortable routines. Bear would wake up early and help with the morning chores before walking up to his cabin to work on his woodworking projects. He had started making furniture and decorative items from the fallen trees around his property. The sisters would tend to their garden, take care of the animals, and handle the household tasks they had been doing for years. In the evenings, they would all gather on the front porch or around the kitchen table, sharing meals and conversation. Bear told stories about his years alone on the mountain. The sisters shared memories of their late husbands and their younger days. They played card games, listened to the radio, and planned improvements to the property. The financial arrangement was working well too. Bear used the money from selling his woodworking projects to pay back the loans from Dr. Hayes and the other townspeople. The sisters' salaries gave them security they hadn't felt in years. For the first time since their husbands died, they didn't have to worry about money, but more importantly, they all had something they hadn't expected to find again: family. As fall arrived, Bear made a decision that surprised even himself. He moved permanently into the sisters' house, taking over the small room that had been used for storage. His mountain cabin became a workshop where he could pursue his woodworking without disturbing anyone. The arrangement raised some eyebrows in town at first. A few gossips whispered about the impropriety of a single man living with 3 widowed women. But most people could see that this was a family built on mutual respect and genuine affection, not scandal. Winter came early that year, just like the year before. But this time, Bear wasn't alone and struggling to survive. Instead, he was part of a household that was prepared for the cold months. The sisters had taught him how to properly preserve food, store firewood, and winterize the house. When the snow started falling, they were ready. On Christmas morning, Bear woke up to the smell of Martha's famous cinnamon rolls and the sound of his 3 housemates laughing in the kitchen. He had bought simple gifts for each of them, a new cookbook for Ruth, gardening gloves for Martha, and a set of quality tools for Grace. They had made him a warm quilt and a hand-knitted sweater. As they sat around the Christmas tree that Grace had insisted on cutting from their own land, Bear reflected on how much his life had changed. A year ago, he had been a bitter, lonely man who avoided human contact. Now he was part of a family that cared about each other and worked together to build a good life. The sisters had changed too. They were more confident now, more willing to speak up in town and assert themselves. They had learned that they were valued members of the community, not the unwanted outcasts they had believed themselves to be. By the spring of Bear's 2nd year on the property, their unusual household had become an accepted part of Cedar Falls life. People would stop by to buy Bear's woodworking projects or to purchase vegetables and eggs from the sisters' expanded garden operation. Local children would sometimes come by after school to help with chores and listen to Bear's stories about mountain wildlife. The sisters enjoyed having young people around, and Bear discovered he had a talent for teaching outdoor skills. Dr. Hayes started bringing other elderly patients to visit, knowing that the sisters were good company for people who might be lonely. The house became an unofficial community center for anyone who needed friendship or practical help. One evening in late spring, as they sat on the front porch watching the sunset, Martha brought up something they had all been thinking about. "Bear," she said, "we've been wondering about something. You saved our home and gave us a new life. But what did you get out of this arrangement? You spent all your money, took on debt, and gave up your solitude. What was in it for you?" Bear thought for a long moment before answering. "You know," he said finally, "I thought I wanted to live alone. I thought other people were nothing but trouble and complications. But you 3 taught me something important." He gestured toward the garden, the well-maintained house, and the peaceful mountain view. "You taught me that taking care of other people isn't a burden. It's what makes life worth living. I spent 8 years alone on that mountain, but I wasn't really living. I was just surviving." Ruth wiped her eyes with her apron. "You gave us more than a home, Bear. You gave us dignity. You stood up in front of the whole town and told them we were worth something." "You were always worth something," Bear said. "I just made sure other people knew it too." Grace, who rarely got emotional, reached over and patted Bear's rough hand. "We're family now," she said simply. "That's what matters." As the years passed, their little family continued to thrive. Bear's woodworking business grew successful enough that he was able to pay off all his debts and even save money again. The sisters' garden and egg business provided a steady income and gave them a sense of purpose. They took care of each other through illnesses and injuries, celebrated birthdays and holidays together, and became known throughout the county as an example of how people could create their own families based on love and mutual support rather than just blood relations. Bear never did return to his solitary life on the mountain. He had learned that the best way to save himself was to save others first. And the 3 women who had once been considered unwanted by their community had taught an entire town about the power of kindness and the importance of looking out for your